The United States had indeed now made a decision to join the most horrific war in the history of the planet. And Woodrow Wilson was also confronted with the very difficult reality that he had dramatically switched gears on his campaign promises of just a few months before. He had promised the country he would stay out of the war. He had promised the country that we would remain neutral. And now, within just a few months, we had completely reversed that policy. Wilson was greatly concerned by this, and as I've suggested to you, he really was reluctant to bring the United States into the war. But now that we were engaged in the war, Woodrow Wilson launched a vast campaign on the home front to try to convince the American people that, in fact, this was the right decision. The war machine on the home front was cranked into full effect, both militarily and in terms of ideology. And we'll talk about a number of efforts going forward made by Wilson and his administration to try to maintain the support of the American people and even win over the will of the American people. This was, in some ways, a war of slogans. You've no doubt heard some of the slogans that were applied to the First World War. Slogans like, "The war to make the world safe for democracy." Well, again, this is in part a way of winning over the support of the American people. Well, if this war is going to make the world safe for democracy, then okay, we can support that. The war to end all wars. No, we know, again, in hindsight how that works out, but at the time it was thought that this war would resolve all of the differences out there in the world. So again, it's sort of a noble cause that you can get behind. We also see during this period the implementation of the draft, the Selective Service Act during World War I, which was enforced with quiet efficiency, although it did inspire a fair amount of opposition during this time. And we will talk again a little bit later about some of the responses to those who may have objected to the war or to the draft and the way things were being done. At the same time, this period and this part of the war saw a tremendous amount of volunteerism. American boys, by the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, rallied to the flag, rallied to the cause, and volunteered to go fight in the war. Many of them, as we will see, ensnared by simply the excitement of what was going on. These are young men, many of them from the countryside. They were living on the farm and really not doing much of anything. And here is this conflict that promises an invigorating and exciting trip over to Europe. And of course, many of these young men literally didn't know what they were getting into. Nonetheless, there was a great support for the war during this time. And so Woodrow Wilson and his administration began to wage an intense ideological war on the home front. The war for the hearts and minds, the support of the American people during this time. This is one of the areas where Woodrow Wilson becomes very controversial among historians. Wilson, perhaps one of the more divisive presidents in American history in terms of the opinion of historians. Some historians have Woodrow Wilson rated quite high amongst the list, and other historians put Wilson very low and are very troubled by some of the things that he did. And actually, it is this ideological war in which Wilson crosses the line for many historians and becomes among our worst presidents in at least the minds of some historians. And so this reaches its most disturbing level with the creation of the Committee on Public Information. So Wilson creates this Committee on Public Information. It was headed by a man named George Creel. Creel was a newspaperman from Mississippi, and so he understood very well things like advertising, things like headlines, and how to connect, how to reach a readership, how to win over people to a cause. And so the Committee on Public Information was designed at heart to drum up support for the war and keep the American people behind the war effort. And so one of the main elements of the CPI was a propaganda campaign. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with some of the colorful posters from World War I. And actually, we'll look at a few of those in just a moment. But there were many posters, there were songs, there were flyers, there were leaflets, people making speeches constantly in support of the war. Related to this, Creel and his team trained a small army of men who were known as the 4-Minute Men to go out all around the country and give speeches. And so they would go anywhere that there was a public gathering and they could have a few minutes, whether it be the movie theaters or some other kind of performance or college classrooms or wherever, churches, wherever there would be groups of people gathered. And they would give these short speeches, a 4-minute speech explaining the war, supporting the war, and telling the American people why they should be behind it. So far, it would seem none of these elements are terribly bad. Certainly in wartime, you want to have a patriotic sort of support for the war. You want the American people to be proud and supportive of what they are doing. But the CPI also crosses a line, and it engages in some darker activities that many historians argue begins to create what has been referred to as a super patriotism. And you might know some people like this even now, who are just so rah-rah, hyper-patriotic, that they have no objectivity, no ability to think critically about their own country or their own team, whatever it might be, at all. All they can see is the one perspective of their own country. And in essence, that's what the CPI was trying to do. There's no room for questioning anything about the government or the war or the way things are being done. There's no room to doubt what the American people were seeing. And another sort of dangerous element of the CPI and its activities is that it began to condemn all things German in this country. And we need to keep in mind that those of German heritage represented one of the largest groups in this country. More than 10 million Americans derived from German stock, going back deep into our history as German immigrants came over. So these kinds of actions, condemning anything German, affected a huge number of American citizens. Just a few examples of the kinds of things that were done during this war. The music of Wagner was banned during World War I. There was no sauerkraut during World War I. It was renamed Liberty Cabbage. And some of you perhaps may remember in our own recent history a time when we did away with French fries for a little while in this country. I don't know if any of you would remember that, but during a period when we were not too happy with the French, we did away with French fries, and instead they were called freedom fries for a little while. And so there was no sauerkraut. It was named Liberty Cabbage. There are also rumors of Dachshunds, the little wiener dogs, being stoned in the streets because they represented Germany. So intense was the hatred and mistreatment of Germans that many Germans in this country changed their names during this time so that they would not be so recognizable as German. As one example, there were many people named Schmidt who changed their last name to Smith. And there are actually many, many different names, and some family names even now can trace back to World War I when they changed their name. Perhaps most disturbing, the CPI assembled a secret list of names of people who it determined might be sympathetic to the Germans or might be aiding the enemy in some way or disrupting the effort on the home front. Jane Addams, for a time, was on some of these lists during the war. The American government also passed a series of laws to protect American interests during the war. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, most prominent among them. And the Sedition Act was the one that was most controversial because it made illegal any kind of statement against the government, against the war effort, or against the president. This is a country that celebrates free speech, correct? So a law like this undermines free speech for a time. In fact, we are a country rooted in the right to protest and the ability to protest. So the Sedition Act was considered by many a very dangerous act and in some ways an un-American act. And yet it was not simply an empty letter either. More than 1,500 Americans were arrested under the Sedition Act during the war years, and many of them spent time in jail for some form of protest or speaking out against the war. These are just a small sample of the many hundreds of posters that circulated during World War I. And you see in each case the sort of racism that was directed against the Germans during this time. They are referred to as the Hun. There is the suggestion that they are devious and sneaky and shadowy. You kind of see in the posters there in the background the German figures in dark, shadowy kind of form. Or in the poster in the forefront, the very famous poster, they are simply depicted as these brutal savages. Destroy this mad brute, enlist. And so we will see similar things with World War II as well. But these posters created by the CPI, drumming up support for the war, encouraging Americans to buy Liberty bonds. These are going to help to pay for the war, or to enlist, and at the same time degrading Germans, this kind of hatred and suspicion against the Germans. And just imagine, more than 10 million Americans of German heritage, and perhaps how they might have felt in viewing posters like these.